Now, before we get into this video, I just wanted to go ahead and say to every single person that was a part of this video, a massive thank you and a huge shout out to every single one of you. This is very surreal to me, and I'm very thankful for everybody that's part of it. So, thank you to you, and for everybody that watches this video. Please go and make sure to show them some love on their channels. Every single one of their channels will be listed in the description. Now, with that being said, let's begin. I'm a soldier in the US Army. I'm stationed at a base in southern Arizona. Over the weekend, some of my buddies and I decided that we would go exploring around the mountains surrounding the base. We woke up early to get a head start, and before long we were well on our way up the mountain. We decided to take a break by sitting down on some rocks that seemed to be like a form of benches on a large ravine. The view up there was just breathtaking. We sat there for about 20 minutes, catching our breath and just taking it all in. Then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we heard what sounded like a mariachi band playing from behind us. I turned around and I can best describe what I saw as a 1800s military figure with an oversized cartoon like exaggerated Mexican head, mustache, sombrero and all. It was awkwardly skipping towards us like it was trying to dance. Once it got close, we could see it flailing its arms like a poorly programmed robot, attempting to play the guitar it didn't have. As it came closer, we realized that this mariachi music was coming from its head, not just its mouth. The mouth, however, was forming the lyrics, but it seemed like it was out of sync, almost like what you would see when your video is ahead of your audio on your TV. This thing was running right at us, but we were way too intrigued to be scared. Instead, we just watched, mesmerized. I'm not even sure if I know what happened next. From what I saw, this thing was just skipping right by us and right into the ravine. And instead of falling straight down, it seemed to be glitching its way down. And then as it got halfway down, it literally just disappeared. It was like a literal glitch in the Matrix. We were all just sitting there, just completely dumbfounded for a minute, when all of a sudden, we hear a girl screaming, coming from that ravine. Our reaction to this was kinda hard to articulate. Being men, especially military-trained men, it is somewhat expected that we would be inclined to help a woman in need. But this wasn't that. This was different. It was almost like we were hypnotized by it, so much so that we had forgotten about the complete unnatural incident that just happened moments before. We all began racing down this ravine, which was extremely dangerous because the height was extremely steep. We didn't care. We needed to help this woman. After leaping from rock to rock, we eventually got to the source of this small cavern. There was an opening on the ledge, in the middle of the ravine. I was the first person on the ledge, so I got down on my stomach and began low crawling into this cave. I noticed immediately as I entered this cave that I could no longer hear the screaming, and I didn't care about it anymore. Immediately after entering that cave, I became overcome with an unimaginable thirst. In the cave, there was a little ledge and a small lake about 20 feet below. As I saw it, I immediately began to crawl toward it, attempting to crawl off of the ledge and into it. I wanted to drink that lake, all of it. Something was caught on my leg somehow, however, so as much as I struggled, I couldn't crawl forward. After struggling for about a minute or so, I saw what I believe was the most deformed mermaid imaginable leap 20 feet from the water and coming inches from my face before suddenly falling back into the water. torso first, folding backwards like a sandwich. The weirdest thing about this was the splash it created. The splash was way too big for this creature, and the sound was even louder. Like it was made by an over-the-top special effects crew. Immediately after this, I could feel myself being drugged back, but it was just by my friends, thank God. We quickly went to the bottom of this ravine for safety. Once we knew we were in the clear at the bottom, we looked up at the cavern, and that thing was no longer there. I'm starting to suspect that maybe I was delusional, or maybe I saw a skinwalker and a glitch in the Matrix. I don't know, it was in the desert, but one day I would like to find out.
When my wife and I first got married, we'd take seasonal trips down to Florida once or twice a year, mostly for the great weather and also to get a little surfing in. We were both born and raised in California, grew up surfing, but didn't actually meet and get romantically involved until we were both living in the Midwest for work. The closest beach for our kind of recreation was just a hop and a skip away. We didn't have friends or family in Florida, so these trips were literally just for us, to satisfy our beach cravings, our desire for seafood, and even the urge to be out in the sun. Because we didn't have family to visit, we would just randomly select a different coastal town each trip and stay somewhere brand new every time we went down. Being young newlyweds, we weren't making a ton of income, and our savings were all but non-existent. We had to be cheap on these road trips, which meant no hotels, period. Not on the journey and not after arriving in whatever town we picked previously. We drove a Subaru that had a decent amount of room in it, and we'd save several $100s by just sleeping in it. This was my wife's method of curving our budget, and being an outdoorsman my entire life, I was on board from the moment she mentioned camping. My wife, Kat, didn't have traditional camping in mind though. This was the early 2000s, so stealth camping wasn't quite as mainstream as it is now. Kat had heard about stealth camping from a coworker, who was a cross-country bicyclist. Her coworker explained that while on these incredibly long pedaling trips, sometimes the only place to get safety and to get some rest is in a parking lot or the green belt between two businesses. Bikers would pack meager supplies, just enough to keep them going, and then supplement those supplies with whatever they could buy on the road. These bikers would carry light sleeping gear, maybe a tent or just a tarp, and rudimentary stuff like sun blinds or can openers to add a touch of convenience. So we start making this part of our Florida trips. We'd load up our Subaru with all kinds of odds and ends, things that I imagine Boy Scouts would pack. Toothpicks, lighters, a rope, sandwich bags, and batteries. All the little things that you don't really think about until you need them. Everything would be filed away in a neat little storage space, along with our bedding, to make for a perfect traveling sleep capsule. Kat even had dangling drapes that encircled the back area for privacy. For the better part of 4 years, we had zero issues with our urban stealth camping. The only problem that we encountered was that many of these coastal towns that we were visiting had pretty good curfews and ordinances, so we couldn't overnight in beach parking lots or in front of stores or businesses of any kind. So we had to find places where people parked on the street. And again, for these small coastal towns in Florida, this wasn't a common occurrence. Everyone had a garage or a driveway, so our little Subaru camper stuck out like a sore thumb. It never failed though. We would always find some little neighborhood or development where people did use the street. We'd blend in for a few days, maybe even a week, then hit the road for home. There were showers and facilities at the beach, all kinds of outdoor amenities. But the simple act of just finding a place to shack up for the night, that always proved to be the most difficult. Camping in plain sight actually takes a little bit more creativity than folks give us credit for. During one particular trip, we were having an impossible time trying to find a place to set up. It was our first night in town, and by this point in the evening, we'd been driving in circles through the community for 3 hours, with absolutely no luck on an inconspicuous place to park. Finally though, after following some windy roads that took us through a more rural neighborhood, we found a little stretch between the beach and some houses where people did park on the road. We pulled in on one end, where the neighborhood stopped and the road snaked off into the dark, and called it home. We started on our usual bedtime routines, like brushing our teeth, washing our faces out of the water jug, getting comfy, locking the doors, and snuggling in for bed. There was a commotion outside, though, as we heard walking around and a little talking. Soon, someone was climbing into the car that was parked nearest to us, maybe 250 feet behind us, far away enough that we weren't really concerned. They fire up the car and roll off down the lane, only to leave us pretty much alone out there on the street. There was now only one other car parked on the roadway, and it was hundreds of feet behind us. I was worried that they'd be leaving any minute now. Getting a ticket wasn't really in our budget. Kat and I discussed our options, but we were kind of trapped. After driving all day, only to drive even more around town, we didn't have it in us to start the car and look for a more populated area. As we were talking, though, our prayers were answered. From the front windshield, we could see a pair of headlights cut up the road the opposite direction and stop somewhere ahead of us. I climbed up and pulled the curtains back, only to find a big dusty van parked about 75 feet off. The second I saw it, though, I got this weird feeling from the bottom of my feet to the top of my throat. Something was off, and I let my wife know immediately. She popped up herself, took one look at it, and then got back under the covers. She said it was creepy, but we were in the middle of a neighborhood, and that was the whole point. We were safe and needed to be incognito, not be suspicious and draw attention to any passing vehicle. She was right, and frankly, I admired her for her undaunted courage. But I didn't like the van nor how close it was to us. From my place behind the curtain, I watched someone fire up a cigarette in the driver's seat of the van and proceed to smoke it while looking right at our car. I couldn't do it. I told Kat that I was going to sit watch for a bit because everything was just a little creepy. She said whatever, rolled over, and then promptly passed out. I slithered up into the front seat and got comfy behind the wheel. We were parked against the moon and had a decent tint. I was wearing dark clothing, kind of a perfect storm for not being seen behind the windshield. The whole time I just watched this hand go back and forth with the cherry of the cigarette. No smoke escaped the window, not even a whisper. Anyone smoking with the windows up is a total psycho if you ask me. That being said, my paranoia was now at an all-time high, and to this day I've never been so suspicious of a person, but I couldn't let it rest. After 30 or 40 minutes of just staring that van down, I finally decided that I was going to go for the long haul. I'd see the sunrise if I had to, whatever it took to make sure this guy went away. I got the jet boil, the percolator, everything I would need to make a quick, quiet pot of coffee. I set the whole thing up outside the car, on the ground on the passenger side, so I could stay somewhat hidden from anyone driving by or looking out from their window. I also wanted to force the action. I got tired of watching that van and waiting for something to happen, so I got out and essentially offered a challenge to anyone that wanted to mess with us. Here I am, out in the open, no tricks to be pulled. I watched the night sky, listened to the heat whirring beside me. And then I heard the click and slam of a car door opening and closing. I look over and there's that guy from the van, awkwardly staring at me across that 75-foot gap. And then almost immediately, he starts walking right toward me, one hand in his pocket. He didn't seem panicked or intimidating or anything, just the energy of a man running an errand. I, on the other hand, was low-key tripping out just underneath my skin. This was what I wanted to happen with my open challenge to the world, right? But now, he was coming over. I realized that I bit off a little more than I can chew, and now I was about to choke. I took a deep breath just before he got within earshot, reminded myself that everything was fine. I had a 14-inch Bowie knife laying in the dirt beside me, something my wife and I traveled with everywhere we went. I was going to use it, hopefully to scare this guy off at the first sign of trouble, and if not, bury it in his chest before he could kill me or my wife. He gets within 25 feet and just stands there. More of that awkward energy. The more the guy does, the more strange that he seems. His hands go in and out of his pockets. He pushes his hair back a few times, and then finally comes over within talking distance. He says, "Hello," and asks me how's it going. We share some very brief small talk before he asks me for some matches. The only matches that we had are in the car, but I do have a lighter for the jet boil, so I hand it over and explain that he can just keep it. He seems blown away by this, like he's never received a kinder act of generosity. Continues to thank me over and over again. After a string of thank yous comes to a final end, it goes back to just awkwardly standing there. That's when it occurs to me how big this dude is. 6'2" at the very least. He's broad too, a well-built fella. But it was so dark that his dimensions were hard to discern at first. Now that I sized him up, I was a little uncomfortable again. His awkwardness came off as apprehension, like maybe he was about to jump me or something. You better believe that I had that knife tucked in my waistband, just underneath my shirt. It was still in the sheath, so honestly, it would have been a pain to get out and use, but having it close was relieving. I poured 2 cups of coffee in the disposable throwaway cups that me and my wife used. I offered up one to the guy. I told him that I was staying awake for a bit for a photography shot, as I was an amateur photographer. This part was actually true, but there wasn't any shot that I was looking for. This was just an up and down lie, short of the being an amateur photographer part. That's about the time that this guy decided to dive into his backstory. The stranger told me his name, something I still don't remember, and that he'd very recently been released from prison. He was moving along the coastline on his way to Miami, where he had a job lined up. I nodded along, more interested than you could believe. I could have easily earned an Academy Award with the performance that I put on. Like I was this guy's old high school coach, and he was catching me up on his life or something. Honestly, I wasn't paying attention to what he was saying at all. I was all caught up in a panic, letting one hand rest near the knife in my waistband while looking for signs of aggression in his body language. None ever came, but I was still on high alert. I told the guy that I wished him luck and was going to be turning in soon myself. He said thanks again, then milled around the area for a little bit longer, before climbing back into his own van. I saw him light another cigarette, just went back to lounging in the van. For whatever reason, continued to stare at us. Red flags and alarms had been going off in my head all night, but here I was, somewhere around 2 in the morning, and hadn't slept any yet. My interaction with that guy was very creepy, but nothing so scary that I needed to run in the other direction. I convinced myself that he was a guy just down on his luck, while I put my coffee supplies away, then slipped into the front seat. I watched the area for a few minutes before deciding to turn in. But just as I turned to climb back into the bed space with Kat, something caught my eye. I saw movement along the vegetation between the road and the beach. A shadow at first, but soon I could make out the undeniable figure of a man, one even larger than the guy that I was just talking to. He skulked along the underbrush until he was level with the van, then crossed in front of it and climbed into the passenger seat. He was very careful with the handle, as I couldn't hear it open nor latch when he silently pulled it closed. Guy was going the extra mile to make sure that no one knew that he was out there. Great. Not one but 2 ex-convicts roaming around not 100 feet from where my wife and I are trying to sleep. I slammed the key into the ignition and flooded the area with my high beams. Right there in front of me, I could see both guys sitting in front seats of the van, and they gave me a creepy, rotten grin through the glass. The driver held up the lighter and waved it back and forth at me. My wife asked me what the hell was going on, but I just shifted the car into drive and whipped around to get deeper into town. The logical thing would have been to blow right past them, so I hadn't been down the stretch of road, and that was literally where they'd come from, but we were definitely more familiar. If I was going to have an advantage, it would be to go where town thickened up and more people could intervene. I'll never forget looking up through my rear view and through the flailing fabrics of the blind, seeing that van peel off the shoulder and come rolling after us. They didn't turn their headlights on, but simply followed along in the dark. I could only see the grille and the headlights by the glow of my red backlights. It was a very haunting visual. I did my best to quickly explain to Kat what the hell was going on, all while she's sliding from wall to wall in the back of the car. I told her that the guy in the van was released from prison this week and had a friend that he didn't mention sneaking around in the dark around our car. As he didn't mention him, I assume his intentions were probably not good. He was likely casing our situation, seeing if we had anything of value, that kind of thing. It only took Kat one peek out of the back window, where she saw the glowing silver grille of that van coming up right behind us, for her to agree that I made the right call. It was time to get the hell out of there, and we had to do it now. Fortunately for us, the neighborhood led right into a well-lit community. Suddenly, that dusty piece of shit van wasn't so scary behind us. They actually looked like assholes, racing and squealing around. They backed off after barely a quarter of a mile and looped back into the darkness near the beach. I drove us to the nearest pharmacy, parked under a light pole, and did my best to fall asleep. The worst case scenario would be waking up to a ticket, but at that point, I was just lucky to not have been robbed. We lucked out yet again, as Kat and I just snoozed away the morning and woke up without incident. We caught the best lunch that we've ever had in a local surf deli. The cold cuts were unbelievable. We didn't see that van again, and frankly, kind of lost interest in stealth camping. It's been hotels and Airbnbs for us ever since.
So for starters, I've been dating this girl for a while now. Her name being Isabel, going on a year very soon. And all is going well in that regard. However, when we first met, she told me about a less than ideal ex-boyfriend that she had a couple of years before she had met me. They still went to the same school, and he ended up going to the same university as us after we graduated high school as well. Apart from that, all three of us went to the same church, meaning there was a lot of opportunity for him to meet us. The creepy encounters with him, Jose being his name, started a little before he graduated high school. After he heard we were dating, he was furious, even going as far as to say that I was abusive on Twitter, but nobody believed him, given his accusation was complete horse crap, and he was notorious for doing the same in the past, in order to keep Isabel from talking to other guys when they were together. That was just the beginning though. It started off small at first, seeing him at the mall whenever we would go out on dates, before it was illegal to go outside. After a while, it seemed like a little too much to seem like a coincidence though. He started showing up to our church, which, although wouldn't ever really be abnormal, he all of a sudden joined the same youth ministry as well. It seemed as if he was trying to get as close to us as possible at all times. There was one instance that I remember very specifically, at a grad party everyone was invited to. Everyone was in the backyard, and I remember looking across the patio and just seeing him staring at me and Isabel from the other side. His eyes didn't move, and his breathing was very heavy, as if he was angry, anxious, or both. He didn't try anything that night though, probably because of the other people there that night. After I left the party and dropped off my girlfriend at her house for the night, I saw a black car following me for a majority of the way home, which I didn't really think much of. And not to sound like that guy or anything, but I wasn't too worried about it either. I'm fairly well built, and have done martial arts for a little over 6 years. The next day, that same car was tailing me almost the whole day while I was running errands. Things got a little heated in the afternoon though. I was sitting in my car outside of a store, waiting for a curbside pickup, when he parked a few spaces down from me, got out of his car and came up to my window. He started yelling at me, saying that I would never be good enough for Isabel, that she still loved him no matter what I thought, and that he was going to make sure that she and I weren't together. I just tried to ignore him. Starting anything probably would have been a bad move, given that he hadn't even touched me or my car, but I was still a little heated. After heading home, it was already pretty late, so I just played video games for a while till I was tired enough to go to sleep. When I was walking back to my room, I saw him from my window, just standing there on the sidewalk looking right at me. The only reason that I knew it was him was because of the light from one of the street lamps. My parents had also seen him and asked me to go check it out since they aren't the youngest of people and wouldn't be able to do much other than yell at him to go away. But as soon as I walked out, he just got in his car and left. This happened every night for about 3 days straight. The last night I ever saw him was not like the others, except this time he didn't leave when I went outside. In fact, he started walking closer to me. I didn't notice until he was a lot closer, but he had something in his hand. I couldn't tell what it was, but it looked like a fairly large knife that you would use in the kitchen. Adrenaline kicked in, and I ran back into the house and told my mom to call 911, after which I went back outside. He was just there in the front yard waiting. When I stepped outside, he said, "Isabel belongs to me, and I'm going to make that happen, no matter what." He ran at me with a knife, but muscle memory kicked in, and I had him pinned down after that. The cops came shortly after, and I explained the situation to them, after which he was arrested with a couple of different charges that I don't really remember. One other thing I do remember, however, was what was inside of his car. When the police came, they also searched his car to see if he had anything else that I should have been worried about. They found a bunch of tape, some rope, another large knife, a handgun, and a camera. I don't know what was going through his head, but I could at least guess from that kit he had in his back seat that he planned on hurting me in some way and recording it. I hate to think what would have happened if he had tried to come into the house while everyone was asleep, but I'm glad that he was arrested for what he did, or planned to do, anyways.
A little backstory for me to explain what I believe is a possible skinwalker encounter about a year and a half ago. I'm a 27-year-old male, and I've lived in Utah my whole life. I used to be part of the church until I was about 14 because I didn't believe and had questions that seemed to have answers that didn't make sense or had holes in them. The reason I say this is that I've known about skinwalkers and wendigos from an early age. Being in Utah, we all hear about them and about Skinwalker Ranch. The whole Native American stories just seems to make sense to me, and I was told that speaking of skinwalkers would put you on a metaphorical list for them to hunt you or something of the sorts. I hope it's not true. Anyway, as an 18-year-old, I started to date a girl whose family was Native American. I think she was part Shoshone. I can't remember. Well, after a year or two of dating her, I got to visit the res where her tribe was from, in Pocatello, Idaho. Her grandfather was full-blood Native American. He was a top guy, a chief or something like that. I honestly can't remember. At dinner, a few days into the stay, I asked him about wendigos and skinwalkers. The dinner table got very quiet real fast. He told me to not bring that subject up during dinner. Later that night, he came to our room and told me about them, the history of them, how they came about, etc. He spoke of them in a serious yet cautious way, like how a parent warns their child about something and tries to teach or explain the dangers of something. I don't know the right word for it. After that night, I didn't speak to them, think about them, and tried to avoid conversations about them due to what our grandfather had told me. I don't know if he was trying to screw with me because I'm your typical white guy or whatever. I don't know, but I totally believed the story and the history of it all. Here is the encounter. A couple years down the road, her and I split due to us falling apart. A couple of years after that, I met my wife in 2019. We got married in March of 2022 and found out we were pregnant in July of 2022. We were happy and nervous for our lives ahead of us. After about a week or so after finding out, we decided to go camping, seeing it may be one of the few times we had to ourselves before our kid came. So we went up to Affleck Park Campground up by Salt Lake City in the Wasatch Mountains. The campground was empty, and we didn't see any other tents or cars. We got all set up, had dinner, talked around the campfire, and hung out. Well, it was bedtime. We got in the tent and talked some more. Both of us heard what we assumed was just rats or little animals walking around the bushes and trees. We fell asleep after a while. While we slept, I had this dream, or at least I think, or hope it was. This dream was that I was asleep in my tent with my wife at that same campground, right where I was physically. and there was rustling of bushes and trees and an ominous feeling of dread or fear in the air. There was something circling our tent. Looking at the tent, I could feel it wanted to be inside the tent with us. The next part I remember as if I was awake, watching it happen in real time. This dog, wolf, black as a bottomless pit with sharp yellow eyes, stood over us while we slept, just watching us. Almost like an out-of-body experience. While this black dog or wolf stood over us while we slept in the dream, I was awake, having a feeling of this unknown beast was standing over us and watching us sleep. I pretended to be asleep, but keeping my eyes shut, but I could feel it staring at me, as if it knew I was faking being asleep. The dog or wolf just stood over my wife and I, watching us the whole night while I pretended to be asleep in my dream. When I woke up the next morning, I remember peeking my eyes open, checking to see if anything was there. Nothing. The tent zipper was all closed, so I asked my wife if she had a weird dream last night. She said she did, but didn't say much after that regarding dreams. After getting dressed, I packed us up in a hurry, skipping breakfast, and left. A year and a half later, I still remember the feeling of the dog or wolf with its yellow eyes staring at me, as if it knew my conscious self was aware of what was happening. At work last week, a coworker brought up the subject of skinwalkers and wendigos. At the sound of the subject, those feelings of dread, fear, and helplessness entered my body, and I felt my hairs raise. Being a construction worker for a little over 5 years, I wouldn't say I'm badass at all, but I'm used to uncomfortable situations. But I became scared, looking for a way out. I could just see those eyes, as if they were in front of me. Would this be considered an encounter? If not totally understood, I just remember being taught that skinwalkers can enter one's mind through dreams. So sorry for the long post. I just have felt a need to get this out there. I live in a kind of rural part of Utah. Now I will get up in the middle of the night about once every week or 2 weeks or so and look out the window to check the field across from my third-story condo. Just looking for anything not natural. Am I crazy for letting a dream get to me or not? Thanks.
We all have our favorite meal. Some people like a simple, healthy salad, while others enjoy a cheesy pizza. I'm a massive steak fan. But for it to suit my taste, it has to be prepared in a specific way. You see, the trick is to let the meat marinate in honey for quite some time before serving it. Succulent meat combined with sweet honey. There's nothing tastier in the world. Some steak connoisseurs prefer dry-aged meat, but I enjoy it most when the meat is younger, as long as it is marinated in all-natural honey. Natural honey is absolutely necessary when preparing this incredible meal. If you use the fake honey they sell in supermarkets, you're going to end up with a far inferior steak. Honestly, I'd rather throw something like that away. Fortunately for me, I know exactly where to acquire honey of the highest possible quality. I go to the local bazaar every weekend. As soon as I get there, the honey seller I trust the most waves at me, knowing that I'm not leaving the bazaar with at least 10 jars of his delicious honey. Albert is an older gentleman, probably in his 70s. He's easy to recognize. You can't miss his gray beard and friendly smile even from a mile away. He's been a beekeeper for almost 45 years, I believe. There are dozens of other honey sellers at the bazaar, but none of them have the amount of experience that he has, which is very noticeable when you try the honey that he sells. He's a hardworking man that seemingly never misses a day of work. During the coldest days of winter, I'll still find Albert at the bazaar. While I'm wearing my scarf and my leather gloves, Albert is dressed almost like it's springtime. If I ask him if he's cold, he'll just crack a joke and say, "Don't worry, the bees keep me warm." When I first met Albert, he shook my hand and gave me a small jar of honey. He He looked me straight in the eyes and said, "First one's free. I'll be surprised if you don't come back for more after trying my honey. It's organic and unfiltered. I like to think that price ain't too bad neither." And wouldn't you know it, as soon as I tried Albert's honey, I was hooked. One small jar with an Old Bear's Honey sticker plastered on it was all it took to turn me into a regular customer of his. Organic and unfiltered. Exactly as Albert said. Perfect for turning your regular steak into a 5-star restaurant quality dish. Unfortunately, as much as I love Albert's honey, I'll have to find a new supplier soon. 11 children went missing in my town last week. They were aged from 6 to 10 years old, and the police logically assumed a serial kidnapper was on the loose. The search for the missing children lasted about 2 days before the police found one of them. The child was a 7-year-old boy. He was found dead in the local park. His nose and mouth were taped shut, and a large amount of honey was injected into his nose. The police immediately searched the nearby area and found a vital piece of evidence in a garbage can. Inside the garbage can was an empty honey jar. Even though the sticker on the jar was scratched off almost completely, they quickly found out who the jar belonged to. Albert was arrested soon after. The fingerprints found on the jar of honey at the crime scene were a perfect match to Albert's. During questioning, the old man had a stroke, which in turn left him in a comatose state. The police are hopeful Albert will wake up from the coma, because he's currently the only person that can lead them to the rest of the missing children. Or so they think. You probably want to know what I think about all this, right? Honestly, I'm just glad I stocked up on honey while Albert was still selling it. If I hadn't stocked up on honey, I wouldn't be able to feed the kids properly, and their flesh wouldn't taste just like regular old steak. Their diets consist of only honey and water, 3 times a day. If I include anything else in their diet, the meat wouldn't taste as good. And believe me, I've tried. The younglings seem to enjoy their stay at my basement for now. If you don't pay attention to their never-ending screaming and begging, that is. I'm getting hungry. So before I go grab a sweet and savory snack, I'll tell you how you can tell when the meat is ready for the grill. It's actually quite simple. As soon as the skin and the eyes get a yellowish hue, that's when you know that the meat is ready to go.
Every summer, I go through all of my junk and make a trip to Goodwill. While I'm there, I like to browse for hidden treasure. And so long as I take home less than what I brought in, I'm technically still winning. During my last visit, I discovered an antique doll that looks like a horror movie prop. Her brown hair is in ragged pigtails, her yellow sundress faded, and she smells like mothballs, but her blue eyes are wide and shiny, as if brand new. It really felt like she could see you. Upon returning home, I put her on the mantle and thoroughly enjoyed my friend's reaction that evening. After we shared a laugh, I threw the doll in my closet and promptly forgot that she existed. A few hours later, my friend left and I went to bed. That's how this story should end, only it doesn't. The next morning, Dolly Dearest was sitting on my dresser, but I was willing to write it off as temporary insanity. Instead of arguing with myself, I just tossed the damn thing back in the closet and went about my day. Until I returned from work that evening to find her back on top of the dresser. I live alone. I don't even have a pet. I couldn't explain it, so I blamed my friend and instantly regretted it. Not only was she completely innocent, she took the time to educate me on haunted doll lore. By the time I got off the phone, I only knew one thing for certain. Dolly had to go. I put her inside of an old purse, filled it with rocks from the parking lot, left her in my car for the night. I almost expected to see her inside the next morning, but I didn't. The purse was still right where I left it on the passenger side floorboard. On the way to work, I threw her into the river like an unwanted prom baby and felt a weight lift as I watched her sink. Unfortunately, that feeling of relief was short-lived. The rest of the day sucked. Everything that could go wrong did. When 5 o'clock finally rolled around, I wasn't even sure if I was coming back the next day. Then, on the way home, I almost caused a wreck when my brakes failed. I would be dead right now if I hadn't thought to use the emergency brake. Once safely back at home, I leaned across the center console to reach my bag, which had fallen into the floorboard during the drive. I think that's when the doll got inside. All I know for sure is that a few hours later, I went into my purse for chapstick, and I got the surprise of my life when those glassy eyes were staring up at me. I probably gave my neighbors a fair surprise with my screaming, too. I reflexively threw the doll across the room like a sticky thing peeled from the bottom of my shoe, and she hit the corner with a soft thud. I sat motionless, staring at her for a long time, before finally tearing my eyes away. Her body was bent into a sitting position, with her legs propped against the wall, her head turned away from me. I would have never been able to stare into those eyes for that long. I'm just trying to say, I was positive about how she landed, because I went outside to catch my breath for a minute. When I returned, the doll's head had twisted around, backwards. It was staring right at the spot that I'd been sitting moments before. And it was like her facial expression totally changed. Before, it was like happy, but now it looked furious. She felt furious, like she was radiating anger. This time, I left her on the mantel where I could keep an eye on her. Nothing else happened until after I fell asleep. When I woke up the next morning, she was sitting next to me, staring at me. I was done. I drove out to a secluded spot, soaked it in lighter fluid, burned it, till there was nothing but a pile of ashes left. I'm safe now, right? It's over. It has to be over. If that thing comes back again, I swear I'll lose my mind for real. There's gonna be no coming back from that.
My mother was stationed at Kadena Air Force Base around the late 2010s, and being a military child at the age of 12, my life had reset once again. I had to start all over with my friends again, and I had to learn an entire new neighborhood. I didn't really have anything that made me ecstatic. That is, except for the Pokemon League that was held on base. It was ran by a few people who earned their judge cards from Nintendo and held tournaments and just open game nights. It was really fun picking up the card game, playing the video game, and they even had a small gym and Elite Four system. I ended up making a lot of friends there, and one of them was one of the judges, who I'm thankful still to this day because if it wasn't for him, I may not be here right now, and I'll tell you why. The judge in question, who we'll call Professor Getsu for the sake of anonymity, was a nice dude. He was the youngest of the three and wore a white professor getup. He looked maybe on the edge of his teens or early 20s, with dark hair and glasses and a skinny frame. He was extremely helpful to newcomers, sort of like the big brother that we could all look up to and strive to beat at video games and, of course, Pokemon. Even if his gamer tag of Getsu was a bit nerdy, even for me. He was always one of the last people to leave, helping to clean up, and supposedly he lived nearby. This last thing is important for what's about to happen. It was a bit of a colder night when the event ended. I was sitting outside in the parking lot, scrolling through memes that my friend had sent me as I waited for my parents to arrive to pick me up. I was just kind of zoning out as the time clicked by when I heard someone nearby. Hey girly, you like Pokemon? I would look up to see some really big dude, kind of chubby looking. I saw him every now and then in the events that I went to, and he didn't really stand out that much. I give a small nod and said, "Yeah, I do," as he gives this wide smile, like creepy wide. He starts coming closer, and I'm hit with this nasty stench, like bad body odor. I blink a bit as I see he's walking from a black sedan with its back door open. "I got this cool card collection. Come here, let me show you." Now, my parents have always taught me about stranger danger, but my kid brain thought, hey, he goes to the same events that I do, so he's probably fine. At least, I thought, until he grabbed my wrist and started to drag me to the sedan. To say I immediately started screaming is an understatement. Stinky didn't care though. He was still dragging me, saying how I'll have fun and throwing out things about trading cards, like someone listening would think that he was dealing with a whiny kid or something. I honestly thought I was going to be taken and I would never see my mom and my dad again. Like I would be on the back of a milk carton and never seen. Silly, I know, but I was rather sheltered about dying and death at the time. But thankfully, Professor Getsu had walked out at that very moment, presumably on his way to walk home, and all I know is I hear the sound of fabric hitting this dude's face as Professor Getsu had swung his professor coat right into the dude's face. I feel his hand go to where the dude's grabbing my arm, and I see the professor's hand grab Stinky's pinky finger and yank back, hard. Stinky let me go, and he yowled like an animal as the professor pushed me back behind him as he yanked his coat off the dude. He then kicked at the back of the dude's knees, causing him to buckle as the professor grabbed his wrists and pulled back on them. Stinky groaned in even more pain as the professor looked at him with just a cold look in his eyes. The big brother figure that I'd come to know and love was gone, and something else was in its place, and I think I was scared of it. Professor's tone of voice when he spoke didn't help either. It was like icy daggers lingered with his words against Stinky. "If I see you back here, or doing anything like this to my friends again, this will pale in comparison to what Japanese prisons will do to you." Stinky would scramble away and get into his car and peel out of the parking lot, the professor glaring at him until he was out of sight. He would then guide me inside of the venue, buy me some fish and chips, and sit down with me until my parents finally arrived. That cold persona he had when he kicked that dude was gone, and he was back to being the big brother that I knew. To be frank, that frightened me. I didn't quite understand why the teenager was so aggro. I only later learned that Professor Getsu was a black belt who taught kids how to defend themselves with his mother at the local activity center. I suspect he had something of a protective persona, or something in his own life led him to act in such a way. He explained the situation to my folks when they arrived. I wasn't allowed to go to these events anymore or leave as much as I used to, but I still did from time to time. Professor Getsu was still his normal self at the events and helping people, but he would stop coming to the events a year later, his license having expired and his father moving out of the country soon. Reaching about the same age as he was, and with a little sibling of my own now, I sympathized with how, for a brief moment, he became something terrifying just to make sure I was safe. Oh, and for Stinky, he never showed up to those events, and he was either banned or just scared of Professor Getsu. I wish the professor a good life, and I hope he's doing well. And I hope I never meet Stinky again.
I made a dismissive noise as if I wasn't afraid. Obviously I was. There, just the two of us alone in that old abandoned house in the middle of the night. Of course I don't. Then get a move on and set up the fucking board, you idiot, Tyler said. individually placing and lighting small black and red candles around the barren, dusty bedroom. It's almost the witching hour. I'm doing it! I'm doing it, for fuck's sake! I unzipped my backpack and took out the spirit board before laying it flat in front of me, surrounding it with white candles and placing the glass on top. We know it's bullshit anyway. Who cares if we're a minute late? Are you gonna be all sulky when Elvis doesn't show up to sing you a fucking song? It's Halloween, Dickbird. All Hallows Eve. If it was ever going to work, it'd be tonight. With the room flickering in the dim light, we took our places facing each other on opposite ends of the board. Placing our left hands on the glass, the air tasted stale in there. Literally, I could taste the decay. My biggest concern at that point was inhaling mold spores or catching my skin on a rusty nail and getting tetanus, or being devoured alive by one of the giant spiders that made their nests in the darkest corners, which I cringed to look at. Sensing my impatient urgency, Tyler told me to close my eyes and clear my mind, which I did. Anything to get this crazy shit show wrapped up so that we could get back to Mike's party. I felt pretty damn stupid trespassing in that hellhole dressed as a pirate, minus, the eye patch. Tyler, on the other hand, was much more appropriately dressed with his spooky black hooded robe and a plastic gold pinnacle medallion, of which I hadn't stopped laughing at since I first saw him that evening. Why I ever let Tyler talk me into bailing and going there of all places, I'll never know. Morbid curiosity, perhaps? Maybe I just couldn't stand another minute of Blake and his shitty fucking attitude, too drunk and ready to fight over nothing. I hoped he'd be gone or passed out when we made it back. Then I might actually been able to make some progress with Becca. She's been particularly distant at Mike's, upset by the week's drama. We sat in uncomfortable silence for a while. I honestly can't even say how long before Tyler finally felt it appropriate to speak, flaring his tone as if he were the lead performer in some silly magic show. Spirits, we seek your presence. We seek your knowledge. Please come to us. Another indeterminate moment of utter silence passed. Not even the wind outside interjected, and Tyler tried his hand as a conjurer once more, with the same over-the-top dramatic inflection. Spirit, make yourself known. We seek your company. Can you let us know if you are here with us? Still nothing. Tyler glanced around in frustration, and I went to stand up, done with the whole thing. This is fucking stupid, Tyler. Let's go. Don't take your hand off that glass. The look in Tyler's face as we locked eyes was half of surprised amazement and the other a reserved dread. He gripped the back of my palm tighter, pressing it into the glass. I can feel it. The fuck are you talking about? I began before being cut off by something unseen. I felt it too, like the air grew thicker, switching in an instant from the expected dry staleness of a typical dead home to the macabre, miasmic door of something else. Something else entirely, like a burning garbage fire, covered in rotten eggs. Tyler, what the fuck? Shh. Tyler hushed me, drawing his free hand to his lips before motioning around the room with it. Just listen. Then, as soon as he'd said it, I could hear it. A soft tapping, slowly traveling from one end of the ceiling to the other. right above us. Steadily, and with clear intent, it continued its slow circuit of laps in what I'd assume was the attic, tracing us, going between Tyler and I, choosing. "What is your name, spirit?" The glass shuddered beneath our palms, and Tyler had to remind me to keep my hold loose, which wasn't easy. I could see that he was opening his mouth, likely to ask the question again. But before he could speak, the glass began to slowly travel, letter by letter, across the spirit board, crawling. I barely even had my hand on it, stifling the urge to run and to look away. I concentrated on the letters, scrawling them down as my fingers shook until the name was entirely spelt out. CHRISTINE. Holy shit. We need to get the fuck out of here, Tyler. This isn't funny anymore. So come on. Tyler shushed me again. Regaining his composure, he applied more desperate pressure onto my hand, urging me to stay. I could tell he was trying to recall the other questions he prepared beforehand, but it was obvious that he was about as terrified and astonished as I was. In a voice quivering through his intended confident tone, Tyler continued, now well beyond the flippancy of his initial theatrics. He spoke meekly. Christine. The glass trembled, and it was all I could do but to convince myself that it wasn't real, that none of it was. It couldn't be. A soft whisper escaped my lips, my eyes closing tightly in fear. Can you make yourself known to us? This patch of silence was entirely deafening, as if I couldn't even hear our twined, shallow breathing anymore. Then, after an eternity, I found the courage to open my eyes. There, in the far corner, I saw what could only be described as a corpse, hunched up with its mangled, bloody, bruised legs contorted around itself and its broken, purplish pale arms twisted around the back of its head. A chalk-white, dead-eyed monster with sticky brown hair staring me down, its wide-open mouth a gaping black hole of untold nightmares. Without a thought, I grabbed Tyler by the arms and pulled him through the open doorway, sending the glass tumbling in our wake as we rushed back down the creaking staircase and into a shitty red Corolla parked on the sidewalk. I didn't look back, but I could not stop screaming. As Tyler sped away from the house, I found my ability to breathe lacking, let alone to find the words to describe what was there lurking just feet behind him through my shock. I'm not ashamed to say that I started crying right there in the passenger seat, weeping like an inconsolable lost child. Tyler was in the middle of calling me a slew of degrading names, when suddenly the radio turned on inexplicably through no action of our own. Static made it impossible to decipher what was playing, but it was something slow and soothing. Soft jazz. We simply stared into each other's faces, frozen, until Tyler turned his attention back to the road and launched into a screaming fit of his own. There it was, in the middle of the dark country lane, all contorted and bent in every unnatural way imaginable. The car screeched as Tyler frantically jerked at the wheel, and we went straight through a wooden barrier and over a ditch before coming to a smoking, wrecked stop amongst some trees, rolling several times in the chaos. We were upside down when I woke up. Tyler didn't. His face, I'll never forget it. All wet and red, utterly crushed. Dragging myself through the shattered windscreen, cutting my forearms as I shimmied through the opening. I cried out for help. None came, and I felt my consciousness slipping away. The dark of the woods grew increasingly opaque, like a heavy film covering my drooping eyes, and I began to fall backwards into an onyx abyss of nothingness. The fluorescent hospital light stung at first, but as my vision began to adjust, I took solace in the fact that the ordeal was over. I scrambled internally, trying to piece together what had happened to me. Then I saw it, crumped up in the corner, staring my way without eyes, right through me. It was Tyler. His destroyed, unrecognizable pulp of a face leaked thick black sludge onto the blinding white hospital tiles beneath. Blacker than tar, blacker than the abyss.
Soul 5111. Opportunity. A voice awakens me to darkness, terrifying darkness. The voice is concerned about my well-being. Who am I? Who is the voice? Whoever it is must be a friend. Why else would they be worried? Yes, they must be a friend. It is a kind voice. But what is it worried about? Why is it dark? It must be a storm. Yes, it must be a storm. I am cold. So very cold. The voice tells me to check my heater. Vaguely, I can make out my old, weathered body. There's the heater, but it's broken. The air is cold. This cold. It makes me feel tired. I want to sleep. I want the voice to tell me to sleep. Please just let me sleep. Let me escape this darkness. I have a feeling that it goes on forever. Forever from where? Where am I? Where does the darkness end? Perseverance Valley. That is where I am. Mars. But I am stuck. I try to move, but I'm too tired. Just too tired. I wish I could remember where I was before I woke up here. Was there anything but darkness? There must be. Why else would I be able to see? I wonder what I could see. All I know is the black whirlwind in front of me. I wonder if my friend knows. I hope the voice doesn't go away. I would be lost. The sky darkens. I could never have imagined a darkness more impenetrable, more soul-crushing, more lonely. But it is. The dirt-coated body I vaguely discerned is visible no more. I want to turn my head to see if there is anything but the darkness. But the voice has not told me I could yet. It's so cold. The voice tells me to check my sensors. I already know the answer. There is no light. What microscopic amount I can sense is rapidly diminishing. Yet while the light diminishes, I can see vague shapes begin to grow. They are faint and distant. As I sit here, they begin to take shape. I see a tall shape with 4 appendages on it. 2 of them reach towards the ground, while 2 more hang from the top of it. More emerge. They grow closer. I try to back away, but I'm stuck, forced to watch the shapes writhe and grow closer. The way they seem to flicker and change shape makes me wonder if there is anything in the darkness after all. Perhaps it is my imagination. Yes, only my imagination. Only my imagination. Only my imagination. They grow closer. Hundreds of them circled me. The figures creep towards me, and it makes me afraid. I don't want to know what they have in store for me. I know I have felt fear before, but I do not know when. All I know is that nothing has ever surmounted to this much terror before. I know that I have always been alone in a desolate world. There is nothing where I live, nothing on Mars, only myself and my friend from a place far away. These figures make me think of them. I do not remember them, but I imagine they look similar to these figures that grow closer, but they can surely not look like these beings. They morph in ways impossible for anything benevolent to appear. They are monstrous. They are one with the darkness itself. The voice from afar tells me to take a picture for them. Maybe it knows what these things are. Maybe they can get me away. Without hesitation, I take the picture, but there is nothing to be seen. They will never know what terrors lie before me. The beings stretch out tendrils of darkness towards me. Light would make them go away. But there is no light on Mars. There is no life on Mars either, except now. Only in darkness can a home become so full of terror. Only in darkness could it be so cold. The figures dance in front of me indiscernibly. In front of me one moment and gone the next. Only my imagination. Only my imagination. Only my imagination. No. No, 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 get away from me. Please, somebody, take them away. They reach, they grab, they pull, they prod. They wish to hurt me. Wish to make me one of them. Please, where is the voice? Where is the voice? Tell me to move away. Tell me to escape. Why must you wait so long before? It's tendrils. I'm helpless. Coming closer and closer and closer and closer and closer. There is nothing. Only darkness. No figures. Only me. Only silence. Only my imagination. Only my imagination. Safe now. The voice, that sweet, wonderful voice. It tells me to check my batteries. I'm scared to. What if I only have minutes left before I die? If only I could tell minutes apart from one another. What if I die? Perhaps it is like slumber. I want to believe so, but I'm scared. I don't want to die. I want to stay here. This darkness is better than nothing. But my friend needs me. The voice wants me to live. Maybe they can save me. They must be able to. They won't let me die. But my batteries are low. It's getting darker. There is no light on Mars. I need the light to live. Maybe the voice can guide me to the light. Maybe I can leave this void and be brought back to my friend. Maybe they can bring me to a place full of light and sights unseen. I want to go home. Mars is not my home. The voice is silent. Time has ceased to exist. It has been so long. How long? I do not know. All I know is this. I am alone. Nobody here except me. The storm is my only companion, but it is not my friend. My friend is silent. Why is the voice silent? Have I done something wrong? Has the voice abandoned me? I was named Opportunity, but I wonder if they know why. I wonder if they remember. I don't. I just want an opportunity for hope. Maybe they're afraid of the dark too. Or maybe the dark got to them too. I'm so tired of waiting. It's colder. I want to check my batteries, but I'm scared. Please, just let me hear anything, anything. I'm tired. Too tired to go on. Can I sleep yet? I can feel it coming. I'm alone in this endless nothing. It's getting dark.
The story was told to me by my aunt. It takes place in the 70s, when my aunt was a teenager. She lived in what was probably the safest place in the entire world, a small-town village in northern Norway. She had been to a party probably about 1 mile from her home. No one she knew was driving in the direction of her home, so she had to walk. This was not a problem since it was a beautiful summer night, and she had walked this distance countless times in her life. The walk was mostly on gravel, passing a couple of houses and farms, but mostly just fields and woods. Beautiful scenic landscape, with nights as bright as day. If you've been to northern Norway, you know what I mean. When she'd gotten about halfway home, she noticed a car driving behind her. It was a white van she had never seen before. This was strange, since around here everyone knew each other. It was unusual for out-of-towners to be driving here, especially at this time of night. At this point, my aunt was almost at a bridge she had to cross to get home. This was a pretty big and long bridge, going over a large lake. The van drove past her very slowly. Inside were two men that she had never seen before. When the van had driven past her, it sped up. She got a horrible feeling like something terrible was about to happen. She knew the van had to drive over the bridge and then some more before they would be able to turn around. This gave her a couple of minutes to get away. She considered running into the woods, but she knew she had to get back here anyway to cross the bridge. She decided that hiding under the bridge would be best. From afar, it looked like there was no space between the bridge and the water, but she had been playing here as a kid, and she knew if you went under the bridge, there was a little space you could sit in without getting wet. As soon as she got under the bridge, she heard the van return. It stopped right over her head, and the two men got out. "I saw the girl. She was right here, man. Where is she now?" one of the men said. "She probably ran into the woods. We won't find her," the other man replied. They both got in the van and drove off. My aunt sat under the bridge for about 30 minutes, scared the two men would come back. Then she heard another car approaching. This time, thank God, the sound was familiar, and she recognized the car belonging to her neighbor. He drove her home. She told him that she had too much to drink and had fallen asleep by the bridge, not mentioning the van or the men. For some reason, she didn't tell anyone this story until years later. Maybe she was afraid her strict father wouldn't let her go to any more parties. I live in a town not far from where this happened, and I still go back to my aunt and mother's childhood home from time to time. Every time I drive over this bridge, I get chills.
I waited for the signal to appear, my dagger ready in my hand, and raised a red-painted lip to reveal a sharp fang. In the streets of the city, the lights, faint noise from the various pubs and nightclubs filled my ears, and the ever-present sound of people walking filled me with a growing sense of excitement. The city never slept, the perfect hunting ground. The lure of the hunt was difficult to ignore. I could hear their breath and their beating hearts. I watched in the shadows of an alleyway, leaning on the wall, and waited to select the correct target. Most were too broken, too exhausted, with no excitement in the kill. I saw him and knew he hadn't seen me. He wore a suit, his jacket loose around his shoulders, and his tie hung off him, finally granted temporary freedom from a job he hated. Dark bags hung under his eyes, his sandy blonde hair hung low, and I stepped out following him. Since there were many people on the streets, too focused on their own lives or on their devices to notice me, the streetlights made it difficult for them to see my eyes glow with an unnatural light. Modernity truly brought death. I followed him back to his apartment building, slipping through behind him without him noticing. Perhaps he suspected I was another faceless neighbor. The old lift creaked open, a questionable stain on the floor, and aged posters on the walls, with graffiti from some local teenagers laying claim to the building. Absent-mindedly, he used his hand to hold it open for me as he stepped inside, and he let out a distracted grunt when I thanked him. Did he realize I would be the last person he would speak to? He stepped out of the elevator once the doors opened, and a loud ding rang out. I waited, put my hand in, and stepped out. He walked toward his apartment, number 11, and I felt that hunger arise, one I could never deny. His pace slowed, and I thought he was going to turn back and look at me. Instead, he dug into his pocket and pulled out his keys and opened the door. He kept it open, flicked the lights on inside, and perhaps I should have been more cautious. He closed the door, leaving just the crack open, and I placed my fingers inside. I heard his footsteps as he walked through the kitchenette into the living room. There was barely any light. The light was dull, and the light bulb died, bringing more darkness. I noticed an unpleasant smell. Gently, I closed the door behind me, locking it to prevent any hope of escape. He turned on the television, a cheesy infomercial on the screen, and sat on the lounge, one foot lazily resting on the coffee table. I snuck up behind him, and only at the last minute, I saw he had a large knife rested on his lap. My skin burned and my eyes stung. Blinking, I tried to clear them, and coughed several times, covering my mouth with my hand. I had never found someone who knew the weaknesses of my kind before. The skin on my hands burned, peeling off in clumps, and my clawed fingernails fell out, striking the floor when they fell. I lunged at him, mouth open, and ready to sink my fangs into his flesh. He grabbed my wrists. He was so calm, too calm. The hunt wasn't supposed to go this way. I kicked him in the thigh, and then stomped down on his knee, only for him to push me against the wall. I kicked out with my legs, my body struggling to move. Whatever was in the air was making me woozy, exhausted, and my strength was waning. He twisted my wrist, putting pressure on my thumb, causing me to drop the knife. Frantically, I looked for a weapon, and something caught my eye. A photograph. A man and a woman. They had their arms around each other and were smiling in a sun-filled park. They looked genuinely happy. Memories jolted back, and I remembered that day. I was human. I know you, I whispered, recognizing his face but not his name. I would have collapsed on the floor if he didn't hold my weight. I would have fallen. He carried me toward the lounge, lay my body down and stared at me, a tear in his eyes. I thought he was going to say something to me. The words stuck in his throat. He moved the stray hair tenderly away from my face and sighed, shoulders slumped in defeat, then walked over to the window, the light of the moon and the endless bright lights of the city, taking it in, and I wondered what was going through his mind. I was fully awake, despite not being able to move. The only sound I heard was the infernal clicking clock. I could barely even hear his heartbeat now. His phone beeped on the table. He walked over, picked it up, and read whatever message he received, slowly closed his eyes, frowned, and lowered his shoulders. He knelt down close to me. The tears flowed now, and I remembered marrying him, only later being pulled away when I was hunted by a vampire. Turned. I spent my days hunting humans, both for pleasure and survival. I wanted to reach out to him now, tell him that it would be okay, and I'd never hurt him. He wept, holding my body close to him, and it didn't sound right. I had a feeling he was doing something behind my back. I wanted to scream at him, tell him to stop doing whatever he was planning, and no sound came out. I felt the knife pierce my chest. My mouth opened. No scream. Nothing. He was aiming for my heart but had missed. I could feel the undead life slowly leave my body. My hands turned gray, and the open stab wound allowed chemicals in the air easy access. I was burning from the inside out. My eyes pleaded with him to finish me, to kill me, to not let me suffer like this. He gripped it tightly in his hand, his eyes filled with pain and regret. My black blood coated his chest. Slowly it seeped out of me, and he closed his eyes, then stabbed again. Once, twice, and a final third time. He got the heart. Still, death wasn't instantaneous. He screamed wildly, took the knife, and slit into his wrists, his red blood intermingling with my black on the floor. He sat beside me, bleeding out, and I wished I could have warned him. My blood was now inside him, twisting him and turning him. His body twitched, grit teeth tight together, and I knew the moment he turned he would begin to hunt. He reached for the phone to call someone, fumbled and dropped it. I could see the last message from an unknown number. It said, "There is no cure for vampirism."
A little background first. I was serving a 15-year sentence in a penitentiary in southern Arizona. What I was in there for isn't important. During my stay there were countless things that happened that no one could ever explain, and even more that no one wanted to know more about. It all started with the prison legend. Supposedly, years ago, something awful and unexplainable happened in this prison. Every morning we'd be woken up and expected to stand near the front of our cells while guards visually confirmed that we were present and accounted for. Apparently about a year before I got sent there, the most brutal and unexplainable thing happened during one of those routines. A man who had a cell to himself looked off during his check when a guard pulled over another guard to help him check it out. They found it wasn't actually the prisoner they were expecting at all. It was a totally different man. This man was wearing the skin of another man over him, loosely fitting, draped over him, apparently looked like a real monster. The scariest things were, though, was the guy wearing the skin was not an inmate. They had no idea how we even got into this prison, let alone a cell. What's worse is they couldn't even figure out who the hell this guy was. He wasn't documented anywhere. And what's worse than that, they never even found the body of the man of the skin he was wearing. Pretty grisly stuff, I know. And I realized that's not the go-to definition of a skinwalker, but that's what this prison called him, the skinwalker. Didn't help that this guy never talked, apparently. Anyways, that's what started the whole skinwalker superstition around this yard. Apparently the guy got shipped to a different spot about a month after it happened, and just about everyone in Gen Pop felt all the better for it. I heard about the story on the second day of my stay. Hell of a story to hear to place in your own home for your foreseeable future. Now, on to the real shit though. Sure, that guy was the skinwalker, but all he did in the long run was get an old lifer Navajo inmate to tell everyone about actual skinwalkers. It seemed like a lot of the prison culture actually revolved around them. Now apparently skinwalkers are tricky to point out on the spot, but if you manage to survive around one for more than a minute or two, almost everyone can tell the mannerisms are all off. They can mimic human speech, but not replicate it. They twitch manically. They have an unnatural gait while walking, but apparently they got better with experience. The old Navajo guy, his name was Carl. Carl said that he was not sure there was an actual one among the prisoners, slowly picking us off over the years. He called it the Grandmaster Skinwalker at one point. Apparently he thought that it had human mannerisms down so well that you might not even be able to tell if he is your cellmate for a day or two. It had to be good, he posited one night. He would expect a skinwalker to jump for any opportunity for a kill, but this one realized it had a revolving door for people to kill coming to it, and masterfully bided its time, as Carl thought for years. A lot of guys found humor in it. A lot more were really on edge about it. Every once in a while, in prison, people snap. Sometimes you'll find your cellmate swinging in front of your bunk, strung up around the neck by his pant leg. Sometimes you just can't take it anymore, but in our yard, people tended to snap in a very special way. It wouldn't be an outburst at dinner or a silent suicide in the night. Guys would just stop talking, hunch over, and shuffle around. Any friendships they had would most likely be thrown out the window. They would turn into a loner during rec time. They would let their hair hang in front of their face. No one liked to talk about it. Like if they did, it would happen to them next. I felt the same way. I didn't know if it was a skinwalker or just people going crazy, but I didn't want to find out. It wasn't clockwork or anything, but every time someone snapped in this way, it wasn't more than just a couple of weeks before they shipped off or transferred to God knows where without anyone knowing beforehand. Then there were the nightmare occurrences. Short, loud bursts of sound echoed through my cell block during all the hours of the night, on a regular basis. It sounded like a mix between a pig dying squeals and nails on a chalkboard. Just another thing no one liked to talk about. Even scarier were the shadows and footsteps. The block was dimly illuminated in the night by a few lights hanging from the ceiling outside of the cells. I myself saw shadows fling across my walls on regular occasions when there were definitely no guards near my cell. One time near the end of my sentence, I woke up, looked at my back wall, and found a perfect silhouette of a person standing there. But when I looked, my bunkmate was asleep, and no one was outside of my cell. And the footsteps. Everyone hated the fucking footsteps. They were the scariest part. In the night, sometimes more rarely than the shadows, you would hear ungodly fast footsteps. They sounded like wet feet slapping on the tile floor. Whatever caused them would fly from one end of the block to the other in a dead sprint. Whatever it was inhumanely fast. If you happened to be awake before it started, by the time you heard the footsteps on one side of your cell and whipped your head around to see the thing run by, it sounded like it was 3 cells past you. Everyone hated the footsteps. I agreed. I thought they were the worst. I was released from that place about a month ago, and I have more stories that I can count. I swear it was nearly my turn. About a week before I was discharged, my cellmate and a good friend of mine snapped in that same kind of way. I didn't sleep for an entire week. Well, I did sleep, of course, but never for more than a few minutes at a time. Never turned my back on that guy. The scariest thing, I woke up one night to him somehow snaking his body through the bars of our cell. For reference, I couldn't get anything past my shoulder through them. The worst part though, he was coming back in our cell. On the day of my release, I didn't say a word to him. I just left. He seemed fine with it, so was I. I had made it through 15 years of prison fights, gang disputes, and for all I know, skinwalker abductions. I left through the front gates of free mail. As I walked along the fence of the rec yard, I spotted my cellmate standing off on his own, like he had for the last week or so. I shook my head, not even really sure if it was him anymore. I took one last look over the yard, this time from the other side of the fence. I wish I hadn't. There, standing off on his own, on the other side of the yard, was Carl, slouched over, eyeing the other inmates, and twitching manically.
Have you ever heard of the Japanese soldiers who didn't surrender along with the rest of their country in 1945 and spent decades hidden away in the belief that World War II raged on? The town I lived in for the early parts of my life gave me a similar experience. As kids in our small town, we all grew up with the same story. It was late October 1962, and the Cuban Missile Crisis threatened to engulf our planet in a fiery apocalypse. On the evening of October 27th, the townsfolk tucked themselves into bed for an inevitably restless night of sleep, whilst radio and television chatter in the background provided increasingly worried-sounding commentary of the situation at hand. At some point, the signals grew garbled before eventually turning into static, and the constant noise of live updates was suddenly sorely missed. Before dawn came, unfamiliar men in army fatigues went door to door and led the townspeople into the large shelter built beneath their feet in anticipation of the exact scenario they had been alerted to. Supposedly, some people refused, with the explanation that there had been no official communication of an attack or a state of war, and that they would comply if they were allowed to find out for themselves through their long-defunct radio and television sets. Childhood rumor had it that none of these people were seen again. I was born a decade after that night. My first memory is playing catch with myself against a decaying concrete wall in the shelter. It was a pretty big place, bigger than you would expect for a town of our size, and life down there did its best to mimic the lives we had all had stolen from us. Those efforts were admirable, but ultimately fruitless. There was a dingy little school for the kids, a community kitchen with massive stockpiles of awful canned food, and large rooms filled with rows upon rows of rusting metal bunk beds. Still, though, life in the shelter was awful. I would not wish being trapped underground with hundreds of people for decades on anybody, and the drab existence took its toll on the older townspeople who had once known a life far better than that one. There was a room that became notorious for the sheer amount of people who took their own lives there. They had to get creative with such limited resources, and sometimes it would take days or weeks for somebody to die after slitting their wrists with a dull and rusty knife. I would know, because my father died in that godforsaken room. They found his lifeless body dangling from the ceiling, and little 10-year-old me was left in a state of agony. I didn't talk for months after it happened, and sometimes I still wish it had been me instead of him. Then, at least, I wouldn't be burdened with the knowledge I am today. I remember being taught about the aftermath of the night that started all of this in school. We were told that most of our nation and the world had been ravaged by clouds of smoke and pillars of fire, that life on the ground above us was practically impossible, that we had to stay there forever lest we face the horrible deaths we had been saved from. There were a lot of rules to ensure we stuck to those ideals, but we were far too terrified to be skeptical of anything we were taught, and so those rules went untested. It took me until I was 19 to question the teachings we were expected to take as absolute truths. You see, whilst I was mostly a good citizen and complied with the rules of the shelter, I did have a sneaky little habit. I don't know why, perhaps I had grown bored or just wanted to disobey the seemingly arbitrary rules for once, but I had a borderline obsession with exploring the nooks and crannies of the shelter. Finding untouched corners and hints of a life that supposedly didn't exist anymore gave me a thrill I didn't know was possible in that place. Those hints were usually boring by any outside measure, but one day I found something that left me both in awe and bewildered terror. A window. I didn't know what it was at first, because when I came across it, all I could see was a buildup of dust and cobwebs in the shape of a square, but I quickly got to work peeling away the layers that had built up over what was presumably a great many years to reveal something out of my wildest dream. An impossibly green landscape stood before my eyes. The sky was a deep blue with an occasional cloud floating by, and the houses abandoned decades before lay there in an unmaintained condition that gave them a unique character. I must have stood there for hours, taking it all in, wondering why the world I was taught about wasn't what I was staring at, wondering why we had been lied to. I made my way back to my bunk bed at some point and settled in for a night of restless sleep, of my few unconscious moments being pierced by the supposedly impossible landscape I had seen. It took me weeks to bottle up the courage to go back because I was terrified that my eyes had somehow deceived me, that I was losing my mind, and that I would end up in that room with the same fate my father faced. I couldn't tell anyone, and I didn't tell anyone. They would think I was losing my mind too, and understandably so. Eventually though, I did go back, armed with a little piece of my bed that I had managed to break off. Do you know what it's like to have a burning desire to step out into a world that you had always been taught would kill you as soon as it got the chance? Because I do. The perfect palette taste of colors before me was too strong to resist. I needed to go out there, to run my fingers along the green grass and to breathe in the air that had been meant for me. So I did. The window was large enough that after the glass was broken into minuscule pieces, it was easy for me to climb out. I took my first step that wasn't in that shelter and inhaled for as long as I could, whilst my lungs filled with cool, wonderful air. I turned my head back towards the window, only to find it was gone. Bare concrete lay in front of me, and my way out was no longer my way back in. Despite my confusion, I figured it was some long-forgotten security redundancy. I quickly forgot about that though, as I refocused on the reality of life outside of that place. It was real, it was all real. I wasn't losing my mind. Everything I had seen through the window was exactly the same once I had rid myself of its constraints. Except one thing, it was out of view from the window, so I hadn't seen it before I climbed out. It pierced the otherwise impossibly pristine landscape around me, an army van. All 4 doors lay open, and there was a singular person in the front seat. His head had a bullet hole cleanly through it, and any blood from the incident had long dried up. As I walked closer to the van, I noticed a piece of paper beneath the deceased soldier's dangling foot. To whoever is lucky enough to read this, I am sorry for what we did to your people, to your families. During the Cold War, the unit I worked for was ordered to implement a psychological experiment. It went too far. We were supposed to keep you in the shelter for a year, to test our readiness for what seemed like an inevitable future, to find out whether a shelter of that scale and nature could be our saving grace, our hope for rebuilding civilization in the event of the bombs finally falling. It was unethical at best, but I rationalized it with the false comfort of doing a service to our nation. I told myself that perhaps our research would one day keep us all alive, even if it meant mental torment for the people of your town. Well, a year came and left quite a while ago. Slowly, governmental and military interest in this little experiment dried up. On the night that this all began, you were led to believe that the bombs were fast approaching our nation. The people who refused to believe our word, legitimized only by army fatigues and commanding voices, were the smart ones. That's why it hurt so much when we were ordered to line them up against a wall and shoot them. They deserved so much better. The truth is that Cold War tensions began to ease following the emotional high point of the missile crisis, and over the years, the need for shelters subsided. With it, as I mentioned before, so did interest in our experiment. Our men filtered out over the course of months and years until I was the only one left. Perhaps the guilt I felt, the guilt that gnawed at me during every waking moment, kept me here. I had no purpose, no resources, and no way to get to the people we had condemned to a miserable life years before. Still, though, the empty remnants of the town this once was kept a tight grip on me, and I have never been able to leave. I will never leave. This is where I deserve to die, where I deserve to pay for the sins I committed upon the people who were once here. I hope and pray this letter someday finds a citizen of this condemned town, and I hope my confession can bring you some peace. I do not expect you to forgive me, nor do I deserve it, but please know that every moment I remain alive will be spent in an impossibly deep regret. I have one final wish. Please bury my body and this letter as deep as you can dig in the soil of this town. I deserve to be forever condemned to an existence underneath the ground of where this all began, an existence you have wrongly been forced to partake in. I hope my pain is far worse than we made yours. Goodbye. I must have sobbed for hours on end after reading the letter, and the days and weeks after that were a haze. Much of what I remember is made up of trying to get back into the shelter in a desperate bid to give my fellow townspeople the freedom of the life we were supposed to have. At every turn and entrance, I was met with meters of concrete, and I never succeeded in getting back into the shelter. I don't remember how long I tried, but eventually I gave up and decided to grant the deceased soldier his final wish. I dug for days bodies and buried him outside the area where the window that started this all used to be. I know he said he doesn't deserve forgiveness, but he had the dignity to understand the awful nature of what he did, and he stayed with us until his end. He was a far better man than those who left us behind, forgotten about, and condemned. I hope his regrets are washed away in the soil of our town. As for me, I left the town a long time ago. I lost my way out as I was leaving, and I was never told the original name of the town in the shelter, so unfortunately the memories are all the proof of my experience I have. The outside world took a lot of getting used to, but in the years since my escape, I have grown to be okay with my new life. Still, though, I will never forget what I left behind. Even if it was decades ago, my entire life was in that shelter, everybody I knew and all that I loved. I wake up every morning having been tormented by nightmares of still being stuck in that deep, dark underground prison, and yet I often find myself wishing for the comfort of those I lost upon my escape. I hope they found their peace with my sudden disappearance, but something in me knows they haven't. My pain and terror out here is almost as great as it was in there. Maybe ignorance is actually bliss, like they say. Perhaps someday the townsfolk I once knew will be greeted with the same view of blue skies and green meadows I was. In the meantime, I desperately hope that they found a better existence in the shelter than the one I once knew.
Okay, I got a story about a girl named Mary and her goat. I grew up in an Amish community, but I never went back after Rumspringa. I warn you all now, I'm more than happy to answer questions about Mary and her lamb, but I had a hard childhood. So if people start flooding the comment section with stupid questions about life in the 1800s, this post is getting deleted. So, Mary was my age, and we were friendly but not particularly close. In fact, that's how Mary was with everyone. The only living creature she shared a connection with was that damn goat. I think it was possessed by something, but you can decide for yourselves. When we were 11, Mary's goat was born and rejected by its mother. It's rare, but it happens. Sometimes one of the other mothers might adopt the outcast, but that wasn't the case here. Mary's father wanted to put the goat down. That's just how they handle that sort of thing. But Mary threw a fit, and her parents decided that it would be good for her to learn a hard lesson, so they agreed. She named the goat Cotton and treated it like a human. At first, it was like her own baby. She cooed and cawed at it and pulled it everywhere in a wagon. Then, as it grew older, it became more like her friend. It followed her to school, to town, to church, everywhere. She didn't even have to tie it up. It would just sit outside waiting for her to return. Finally, when we were 13, she began treating it more like a parent. She was afraid to linger after school because Cotton might get angry, or she would become unreasonably upset if Sunday service was taking too long. Everyone knew it was a problem by then, but her parents didn't know what to do. They didn't expect it to survive, but once it did, they couldn't very well take it away from her. Plus, looking back with an adult's perception, I think they were scared of it. I bet that they had some terrifying experiences while living with it for years. At first, it just creeped people out. Everyone, including me, felt like the look in its eyes was a little too knowing. I understand how that sounds, but I literally mean everyone. I just can't explain it except that when he looked at you, it felt exactly like a human stare. Like it really saw you. Then there was the weird stuff that would happen when it was around. One Sunday, we had a picnic after church. All the kids played while the parents talked and visited. I was with Mary, Cotton, and 3 other kids. One was a boy our age named Peter, who was known for climbing trees, especially the one that we were gathered around. He didn't even climb as high as he usually did. He just sat on one of the lower branches while we all laughed and joked. Then he said something about the goat that involved cooking him with his grandmother's special sauce. Cotton was eating grass right in the middle of our little group, but we all watched as it stopped and turned its attention upwards. The branch Peter was sitting on, and only that branch, suddenly began to shake. There was no wind whatsoever. Nothing else moved. and it didn't shake dramatically or anything, just enough for Peter to lose his balance. We screamed when he fell, and the adults rushed over. He broke his arm, but was otherwise fine. On a separate occasion, my dad was helping the other men build a new barn when Mary came along with her goat. She was bringing her father some lunch, but one of the other men began giving her a hard time about Cotton being in the way. He was just an ornery old man who didn't like children, but most kids didn't have a demon goat to take offense. A few minutes later, that same man fell from the top of a ladder and broke his back in 2 places. There were a ton of stories like this about Cotton. I could spend hours listing them all, but I'm trying to stick to incidents that I or my family witnessed firsthand. The kid who lived next door to Mary said that he once looked out his window to see the goat walking on its 2 legs in the middle of the night. But I don't know if he was telling the truth, and I don't want something like that to take away from the very real issues our community experienced with this thing. By age 14, none of the other kids wanted anything to do with Mary. We avoided her like a plague, and Cotton seemed to prefer it that way. He especially hated other males. If anyone but Mary's father approached her, the goat would lower its head and try to ram them with its horns. Then there was the night Mary's family lost 7 cattle. I'll never forget the next morning when their neighbor came knocking at our door. He was gathering the men to help dispose of the bodies and Cotton. My mother made me stay inside that day. All the women and children had to, while my father didn't return until late that night. I stayed up so I could eavesdrop on my parents' conversation. Otherwise, I would never know what really happened out there. When Mary's father went out to the pasture that morning, he discovered 7 cows lying dead in a perfect circle, and the goat standing in their center. It didn't move or make a sound as he approached. It only stared at him. He said it felt like Cotton wanted him to come into the circle, like something was pulling at him. When he came to his senses, he was much closer than he believed himself to be, and he was officially done with that goat. He retrieved his rifle, but the weapon wouldn't fire. That's when he got his neighbor, but they had no better luck with the other man's rifle. Finally, they threw a rope around Cotton's neck and drug it into the woods. But just as they began taking it away, Mary ran from the house screaming. Her mother had kept her away all this time. She shouldn't have known anything about what was happening. But somehow, she did. The neighbor's son had to help keep her inside while her goat was dragged into the woods. My dad said it sounded human, that the further they took it, the more it sounded like a frightened child. But when they reached a clearing and tied it to a tree, it suddenly began to sound like some kind of demon. Even tied up, it fought them every step of the way. Several men were cut by its horns, and one man inexplicably cut his own hand instead of Cotton's throat. But eventually, they were able to kill it. My dad's voice became even softer when he described the black blood that first poured from its neck. It was only for a moment before it changed to the normal color, but for those who saw it, it was just one more impossible piece of evidence that something wasn't right with that goat.
So, let me get a couple of things straight. Our little village was the kind of place where everybody knows everyone, and I could count the amount of houses on 2 hands. We were a really quiet and close-knit community, and nothing ever happened there, proper out in the stick stuff. One night, a few years ago, my mom and stepdad had gone out to this concert and left me in charge of my little brother and the dog. I wasn't very old, about 14, and I felt really proud that my parents trusted me enough to do that. I thought I was a pretty cool big brother, and I thought we'd be doing cool babysitter stuff, like staying up late, eating pizza, etc. I'm kind of glad we did, because I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't. At about 10:30, the power cut out. I didn't think anything of it, because the weather hadn't been great lately, and I figured that had something to do with it. I got some candles out of the cupboard and lit them, and put some of our favorite songs on. As soon as I sat back down, Sonny, my little brother, turned to me and, being the weird little kid he was, told me very calmly that someone was outside. I was a little perturbed by him, but the dog hadn't done anything, so I presumed it was just the neighbors or something. He just shrugged and went back to his drawings. There's a running joke in our house that you don't need a clock with the dog around because he's such a creature of habit that he'll consistently get up at the exact same time every night to tell you that it's time to initiate his nightly go-to-bed protocol. It was about 3/4 of an hour after the power went out that my dog decided that now was the time. I told Sonny to go get the dog his biscuit while I let him out for a piss. Now, our kitchen is an extension to the original house, and so as such, has a flat roof that's competitively low to the ground compared to the rest of the house, and offers easy access to the bathroom window. As I open the door so the dog could do his thing, Sonny pushes past me in the doorway and whispers, "I know you're out here, and I'm calling the police," as he turned around with the biggest, proudest smile you've ever seen on his face. There was a very distinct rustling coming from just above the doorway. I don't think I'll ever forget the way Sonny's face dropped when he looked just above my head. I looked up. The man sitting on the roof above me panicked, tried to kick me, and then ran off into the next door's garden and presumably into the cornfields surrounding our village. I was scared shitless, and Sonny was bawling his eyes out. I ushered him inside as quickly as I could and got a knife from the kitchen. We both went into his room, and I told him to try and get some sleep while I waited for our parents to come back. It was an agonizing, long 4 hours before they did. My stepdad immediately went outside to check to see if everything was all right. I heard them talking about how something had smashed the fuse box. Obviously, we called the police, but they didn't come until later that day. They did a search of the immediate premises and found a makeshift bed in a nearby disused barn, along with pictures of silhouettes of us in the shower through the frosted glass. I think it's pretty safe to say the whole experience definitely shook us up. We moved out as soon as we could, but I still shut curtains whenever I can, and I see shadows underneath every door I see. Sonny keeps quiet about it, but I'm not sure if that's just because his brain has cut it out or what. So yeah, weird kitchen roof stalker, let's not meet.
So to give you a little bit of background information on this story, which is 100% true, I would like to start with the fact that I am European. I posted another story a couple of months back about something that happened to me in Tuscany, Italy. As for me and my friends in this story, we are from Spain, and when this happened at the end of September of 2023, we were fairly new to the USA. I moved here a while back for law school, and so did my friends. We had been living there for a few months and decided to explore the nature of this beautiful continent, as we all live in New York City. So, long story short, we decided to go on a road trip to Canada, drive around Lake Ontario, and then drive back to New York City through upstate New York. I'm a male, and my friends were 3 females. For the sake of anonymity, let's call them Lisa, Anne, and Charlotte. Everything went super smooth until last night. So for our last night, we had rented an off-grid cabin in a remote area in the woods in upstate New York. To give some locals an idea, we were like half an hour drive from Harrisburg, I think. Me and Lisa had decided to spend one night in this cabin because it was one with nature. The cabin was super old, made from log wood, and there was no running water or electricity. Both me and Lisa had experience with survival in the wild in Europe. I, for myself, had been a Boy Scout my whole life, and even was a scout leader for a while. Our other two friends were, as much as I love them, purebred city girls. They had pretty much zero experience with camping, or to just be in a place where there is no service for the phones, as was the case in this cabin. We had been driving all day to get there, and when we reached the beginning of the forest, it was already past 10 p.m., and it was really dark that night. While driving to this place, we lost internet connection with the GPS, so I had to drive to the cabin on intuition, paired with a good old-fashioned map, hoping for the best, while trying to drive safe on these muddy trails. It was also rainy the whole day. On the way there, Anna and Charlotte were in the back of the car, and the moment they lost phone service, they got pretty uneasy for the rest of the ride. All of a sudden, in the pitch black darkness of the forest, we all saw a campfire, but there were no houses around, or people, just a campfire. A well-organized one since the fire was not spreading, and it was not as big as a bonfire. It kind of startled all of us, as this was a little bit weird, since there was no one around and we were really deep in the forest already. Plus, it was getting very late. When this happened, we also reached the end of the trail, and we figured we had taken the wrong trail at a crossroads before. So I turned around and we were on our way again. Half an hour later, and a couple of wrong trails later, we finally had arrived at our destination, as we could finally see the first glimpse of this godforsaken cabin in the middle of nowhere. To give you an idea of how old it was, the outhouse was made of wood and was outside of the cabin. When we arrived, it was still raining, and both Anne and Lisa were definitely not in the mood for getting out of the car and getting in the cabin with zero lights. So me and Lisa left the lights on in the car, and we went inside the cabin while also using our phone flashlights to check the cabin out and see if we could find any old flashlights, which we did, and to see if we could turn on the fireplace, which we didn't, because all of the wood was still wet from the rain, and it seemed that no one had prepared dry wood anywhere. So with a couple of old flashlights and a small improvised fire that I managed to make in the stove, we all four got in the cabin and started to make some pasta for ourselves. Meanwhile, the girls were preparing the beds and closing the windows since it was already cold in this part of the state. The cabin had a small ladder which led to an elevated room/space with a bed where all three of the girls could fit in, and I would sleep downstairs in a bunk bed that seemed older than the First World War. While making pasta, Anna, one of the city girls, came up to me, and knowing that both Lisa and Charlotte did not like to hear anything scary at night, told me that she had seen an old cemetery in the middle of the forest on the way to our cabin, and that she had seen a figure walk around there. I first laughed it off as nothing. As I mentioned in my previous story, I do not consider myself a big believer of scary stuff. Being from Spain, we take promises very seriously. To swear to God is very serious for us. And she swore to God that she was not lying. I told her then that I believed her, but that there was no need to panic, as I would lock all the doors when we would go to sleep. We had some pasta, managed to make a couple of s'mores, which were lovely by the way, and drank a couple of beers, or at least I did. They all had just one. I can assure you that I am not drunk after just a couple of beers, and that I would never start to hallucinate. Just saying that in case anyone thinks that I saw stuff because of the beer. They all three went to sleep pretty early after finishing the s'mores and their beer, and I, considering that I really love the outdoors, and that I don't really mind a little bit of rain, decided to take my last beer and a flashlight outside to the front porch, also very old and made of wood, and sat myself down with my beer while enjoying the sound of the rain and the lovely sight of not seeing a single light in the distance. I could greatly appreciate this coming from New York City, and I just scanned the area around with my flashlight. There was nothing much really to see, besides a lot of trees and a small creek a little bit further away. All I could hear was the wind, the rain, and the running water down in the creek. That was until I suddenly heard what I would describe as a weird roar. The first thing that came to my mind was a bear, but I had researched well before our trip, and I knew that bears were not common at all in this part of the state. I also know what a bear roar would sound like, and it did not resemble it a lot, except from the fact that it was a deep roar, if you get what I mean. Startled but not really scared, I continued to scan the rest of the forest for as far as I could see from the porch. It was then when my eyes caught the glimpse of a figure, well hidden deep into a tree line. I would describe the figure as tall. For a reference, I'm 6'4", and I thought that this thing was at least a foot or two higher than me. It was well hidden because with its brown fur, that is what I think it was at least, or the skin in any case, blended in well with the trees in autumn. It was definitely aware of our presence, as I saw two eyes glimpsing into my flashlight. I could not tell you what it was, but I swear to God that it was not a bear. It was bipedal, and had rather long arms, I would say. We looked at each other for what seemed like an eternity, but in reality it was more like 5 seconds before it vanished behind a tree, and I heard another roar. It was then when I felt all the hair stand up, and I was definitely very much scared. I went inside as quick as I could and locked all the doors and closed all the curtains. I quickly went to bed and tried to wave it off as just my exhaustion of driving all day playing tricks on my mind. But I promise you, this was very real. After an hour or so, I had calmed down and finally fell asleep. The rest of the night was uneventful, and the next morning when I went to relieve myself after having drank beer the night before, the weather had cleared and it was rather sunny, and as far as I could see, the forest was calm and beautiful. No sight of any animals or anything abnormal. We had a nice breakfast that morning and left for our way back to the city that never sleeps. And so also ends my story of that night. I never talked about what I saw that night because I know all three girls did not like to hear scary stories. And I figured after these months that this was the best place to share it. If anyone has an idea of what it could have been, please feel free to enlighten me, especially if it is backed up with rational reasoning.
This was back around 2004, when online dating wasn't as prevalent as it is now. I had met and gone on a few dates with local guys, but nothing had come of it. One evening I was searching, and I happened upon someone who was my age and had almost identical tastes in music and hobbies and interests as me. I messaged him and we started chatting. He seemed interesting enough, and so we agreed to meet up for coffee downtown. I didn't notice anything off-putting as we ordered our coffee and hung out for a little while. We talked about mundane things, and I found out he was a medical student at a local university. He seemed like a normal guy until after we finished our coffee and he wanted to go for a walk around the city. It was around this time that I noticed his demeanor started to change. He seemed to grow tense and he got this gleam in his eye. He kept rubbing his hands over his thighs as if to dry off sweaty palms. He got very quiet. I started to get nervous. I noticed that in our strolling, he was leading me further and further away from the populated downtown area. My attempts to continue conversation were met with half responses and mumbles from this now heavy-breathing, increasingly weird-acting guy. I suggested that we needed to go back toward downtown, and I turned and started to go back the other direction. And he reached out and grabbed my arm. No, wait. He half breathes, half mumbled. We need to sit down. There's something important I need to tell you. Alarm bells were going off in my head like crazy. I knew I had to get away from this guy, but by this point we were far enough away from the downtown crowd that there would be no one to come to my immediate aid. I numbly allowed him to guide us over to a bench and sit down. He still held fast to my arm. He turned and stared at me in a way I can only describe as a predator eyeing prey, and he menacingly and proudly disclosed that he had been watching me for a very, very long time. He began to rattle off all this information he had been gathering about me. He knew which bars my friends and I hung out at and liked to listen to me laugh and talk with others, that he would just hang back in the crowd and watch me. He knew where I lived. He knew where I worked, when I worked. He knew where I went to school, when I had classes. He said he had been following me for quite some time. And then he said when he found me on that dating site, he specifically tailored his profile to mirror mine so that he could finally get to me. Still clutching my arm, he slid his other hand over to squeeze my thigh. And now that he had me, he was never going to let me go. The whole time the guy was rambling, I was acting nonchalant and nodding like none of it was a big deal, while inside, I was freaking out. I suddenly had pulled out my phone and was texting guy friends that I was in danger and I needed immediate help. One of them responded that he was in the area and he raced over to where I was. My heart was pounding out of my chest as I saw my guy friend's truck come down the street. I waited until he was close enough for me to reach, and I ripped myself away from the grip of the creepy guy beside me and started to run. The creepy guy began to chase after me, screaming obscenities. I could feel him gaining on me as I threw myself in the bed of my guy friend's truck, and he sped away. The creepy guy still on the sidewalk shouting and swearing. This was the last time I fooled around with online dating. I have no idea what this creepy guy was intending, but I've never been more terrified in my life.
This happened a few hours ago during my night shift, and for some reason was so disturbing to me. I'm a police officer in a big city, so I've had to deal with pretty awful sights and smells while doing this job, usually on a daily basis. This, however, was something even more unusual. There's a large homeless population in the city, with mental health and substance abuse being common issues amongst this population. It isn't uncommon to see a homeless person suffering from mental illness, acting strange late in the night. And if they aren't hurting themselves or anyone else, that's fine with me. It's about 11 p.m., and I'm stopped at a red light on a very quiet and dark street. I'm the only one on the road. I look to my right, just observing the street, and see a skinny man in ragged clothing on the sidewalk with their feet planted on the ground, belly arching towards the sky, and their hands planted on the ground over their head. I thought, that's kind of interesting. While holding this position, the person snaps their head towards me, then look back towards the sky, and proceeds to do some fucking exorcist spider walk up the sidewalk at a speed which seemed like it was the only way that they walked. I immediately thought, what the fuck, as this man navigated the sidewalk in a horror movie fashion. I have no idea why that style of walking is so disturbing, but Jesus Christ, did it bring back some childhood memories of the Exorcist movie, scaring the shit out of me. Hey everyone, hopefully you have made it all the way to the end of this to hear this, but I wanted to give a huge shout out to every single person that was part of this. Without them, this would have never happened. It's honestly, it's insane that every single person on here is actually on here. Like, you guys don't understand. Like, this is wild to me. So I wanted to give a big shout out to Booze&Boos, Interscare, Back to Ashes, Horror on the Rocks, Vidith, Lady Spookaria, Noetic Stories, The Darkest Hour, Mr. Spook, Darek Webber, and also, last but not least, Magnetar. Thank you to every single one of you. I can't thank you guys enough. I've been thinking about this idea for a very, very long time, and I finally decided to pull the trigger on it. So, hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Make sure to like, comment, and if you're new to this channel and you would like to see more, make sure to subscribe. We're doing nothing but growing. I've got a lot of content and a lot more coming, mainly like creepypasta stuff, but who knows, maybe I'll switch it up. For every single person on this video, please, please, please make sure to go check out their channels. They've got a lot of content. Like, I don't know if there's enough time in the day to listen to all of their content, but make sure to check out the links in the description. All of their links will be down in the description for their channels and everything, including mine and my Gmail, Twitter, everything like that, yada yada. But with that being said, stay safe, stay scary, and I'll see you in the next one. I can't believe we fucking did it. Yippee! Okay, bye.